He was an executioner who had taken the heads of many people who today are considered brave heroes. His favourite method of execution was the guillotine, and during the Second World War, Johan Reichhart would execute thousands of people who were accused of protesting against Hitler's regime and the Nazis. The Germans would adopt the guillotine and make a number of tweaks to it, and they called it the fallbeil, and this metal guillotine was so efficient that within around 10 seconds of a condemned person making their way into an execution chamber, they would have lost their head. Reichhart was considered by Hitler a skilled and reliable man who would be paid well for his bloody work, and who would be credited with making a number of executions less stressful, as he tried to make the executions as quick as possible, meaning that execution times were just 3 to 4 seconds. But he was a man who suffered throughout his later life with the work he was doing. Join us today as we look at the last executioner of Hitler's Reich, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Johan Reichhart was born on the 29th of April 1893, and he had a rather different upbringing, as his family were a family of executioners, and those who were ordered to deal with deceased animals. The Reichharts were generational executioners, and there were at least 8 generations who performed this job, and his father owned a small farm, and would take on extra work to get more money for the family. As a young boy, Johann attended the Volksschule, and he became an apprentice butcher, before he served during the First World War in the German army. But he would be living in Bavaria, where the first shoots of the Nazi Party were growing, as Hitler would later try to seize control of the lands and region during the Munich Putsch. He wanted to inspire revolt and uprising, but this would of course fail. However, in April 1924, Johan Reichhart took over the job of the state judicial executioner in Bavaria from his uncle, who retired. At this time, Johan Reichhart was being paid 150 gold marks for each execution, and he was also given 10 marks for expenses, and was given a third-class railway ticket to carry out the executions. He would travel around different sites and prisons executing, but in the mid-1920s his work slowed down, and during 4 years he only executed 23 people, including just one in 1928, and because of this he was actually struggling to make money. It is a strange concept that someone would need to take the life of another just to try and make ends meet and survive, but he tried to be allowed to take on extra work, and also to be able to execute people in different countries. Reichhart tried other business ideas too, including a transport business which he gave up. However, he was shortly before the Nazis seized power in Germany named in Dutch newspapers. This was a big problem for him, as people now knew what his other job was, and they were unlikely to deal with a man whose job it was to execute others. He had tried to work as a greengrocer and was good at this in The Hague in the Netherlands, but the revelations in the newspapers led to his business yet again failing. But Reichhart continued to perform executions in Germany and in Munich, and he would usually do this inside of Stadelheim prison, using the guillotine or the fallbeil inside of the execution chamber. But when the Nazis came to power, he probably didn't realise how much work he would be doing over the next decade. He signed a new contract with the now Nazi-controlled Bavarian Ministry of Justice to work as their executioner, and he received a fixed wage and a better salary. He was now also allowed to execute condemned individuals in the state of Saxony, and was paid for each of these. The Nazis provided him with guillotines and assistants to perform the job at each of the execution sites he visited, and he now had financial security, where he could just execute for a living. He did join a number of Nazi groups before in April 1937, but then he became a fully paid up member of the Nazi Party, slightly later than many others did across Germany. The Reich Ministry of Justice would then reassign Reichhart to different areas, and he would also now be responsible for Dresden, Stuttgart and Weimar, as well as Munich. He was also, after the Nazi Anschluss of Austria, ordered to execute individuals in Vienna, and also Frankfurt. What this meant is that Johan Reichhart was now being seen by the Nazis as an effective and efficient weapon against those who were rebelling or protesting the regime, and he was a man who was comfortable with executing people from all walks of life. However, the stress of being a man who would perform the job of taking heads would lead him to experience depression, but he worked strangely to make the executions as painless as possible for the condemned. Because of this, he would tweak the guillotine method. For example, for as long as the device was used during the French Revolution, The condemned would be placed on a tipping board or a bascule, which was then slid under the blade, with the person strapped to the wooden board. Reichhart innovated by using a fixed bench, in which the condemned was held by the assistants who were helping, without restraints. Then the blade would be dropped, and he also got rid of the black blindfold, which was placed across the eyes, and also his assistants would hold the condemned eyes closed with his hands. This shortened the process, and the tweaks meant that within 3 to 4 seconds someone could be executed. But Reichhart continued to operate the guillotine, and he would do this inside many other prisons, such as Plötzensee prison. The guillotine here was supplemented in the execution chamber by a large hanging beam, in which people would be strung up from it, and it was inside this chamber where many of those men and women who were condemned by the People's Court met their maker. Reichhart would also use the hanging beam to hang 59 people during his time as a Nazi executioner, but he would execute 2,951 people using the guillotine, and of this specific number, 250 of them were women. Of one of his most infamous executions, it saw him use the guillotine upon Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans Scholl. Reichhart would state with regards to Sophie, a 21-year-old member of the White Rose protest movement, that she would be the bravest person he ever executed. She had been sentenced to death for high treason, after she, along with her brother and others, were found distributing anti-Nazi and anti-war leaflets and propaganda. Sophie was executed on the 22nd of February 1943, 2 minutes before her brother was, in the same chamber and on the same execution device, showing how ruthless and quick Reichhart could be. He also worked in the aftermath of the July 20th plot, in which many people were rounded up by Hitler, accused of being involved in the Wolf's Lair bombing that saw the Führer injured. Hitler gave specific instructions for the executions to be filmed, and for hangings to be performed with piano wire, which was barbaric. Reichhart continued to be busy at this time. However, at the end of the Second World War, he was arrested by the Americans in May 1945. He was imprisoned inside of Stadelheim prison, which he was very familiar with, and the Americans did not try to sentence him to death, as they saw him as a man who was just doing his job, employed by the state as an executioner. But he would help to execute many Nazi war criminals, as the Americans used his skills, and he acted as a consultant to the executions of many concentration camp guards. He would try to use Allied execution methods during the Third Reich, as he appealed to have a British-style gallows with a trapdoor for the long drop method to be built, but Hitler rejected this. But Reichhart, despite the fact he had taken the heads and lives of so many, was living very comfortably in his villa, and he had a number of cars, and he was still technically acting as a judicial executioner in Bavaria, and he had never been sacked from this position. He would retire as an executioner at the end of the war, and worked as a consultant advising the Allies, and it's believed that he would have advised and assisted the infamous American hangman John C. Woods in the executions at Nuremberg and the constructions of the gallows. Woods would famously botch many of these hangings, and the most senior Nazis would in their final moments not get the quick and rapid death that was intended. But Reichhart also assisted in executions inside of Landsberg prison, and hundreds were condemned on the gallows there. However, despite the Americans using his skills, in 1947 he was imprisoned again, and was sentenced to 2 years in a hard labour camp, and he was also sentenced to lose half of his wealth, and he was seen as a symbol of Nazi execution. He claimed at his trial that, "I have carried out death sentences in the firm conviction that I should serve the state with my work, and to comply with lawfully enacted laws. I never doubted the legality of what I was doing." His sentence was reduced, but he was then released, and he spent the rest of his life lonely. His son would take his own life after becoming rather depressed with his father's job and role, but many people across Germany hated him. Reichhart lived on a small pension given to him from the First World War, and he would later speak out against the death penalty. But he would spend the final years of his life inside of psychiatric hospitals and facilities, before he died on the 26th of April 1972, at the age of 78. Johan Reichhart was a man who was employed during the Nazi regime in Germany to execute those men and women who were considered enemies of the Third Reich. He would execute people of all ages from all different walks of life, but most of them were condemned by the People's Court for treason and taking action against the regime imposed by Hitler and his inner circle. He was a judicial executioner and a man appointed to condemn those, and for him, despite being a member of the Nazi Party, he believed it was a job, and it was in his family for generations. But his actions resulted in his kill count being over 3,000 people, and his work would lead him to breakdowns towards the end of his life, and he later spoke out against capital punishment, showing how his feelings had changed over time. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.